So I'm going to talk today about what forests can do, and not just all forests, but particularly new forests, forests that we call regenerating forests. So these are forests that are developing on land that has already once was forested, was cleared or used for agriculture or heavily harvested so that there's not much forest remaining and has an opportunity to regrow, just like all the forests around here in the eastern U.S. And just to give you some idea of how much forest there is out there, there's about 485 gigatons of carbon stored in forests today. A little over half of that is actual biomass, so tree and root biomass. And about 40% of that is carbon in the soil, and about 8% of that is just dead wood that accumulates on the forest floor. But what we've seen historically and continuing today, unfortunately, is continued emissions of CO2 from land use change. So we are still seeing, unfortunately, net emissions from land use change. And in fact, if you were just to look in the tropics and look at all of the carbon emissions from deforestation alone in the tropics and looked at that as if it were a country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world, next to China and the United States. So this is a huge issue, and one that we can envision conquering this one by simply stopping deforestation, any continued deforestation in the tropics. And I want to emphasize the tropics because these are really the heart of our global circulation system in terms of the productivity. So tropical forests produce, have 30% of the global net primary production. That is photosynthesis happening in the tropics. And they store 25% of the carbon in our terrestrial biosphere. So there's a huge importance of focusing on what happens with forest cover in the tropics in any kind of attempt to resolve the climate change mitigation issue. In 2017, this paper was published. Many of you may be familiar with it. This was in PNAS. And this was an attempt to quantify the extent to which all kinds of land stewardship options involving not just forests, but all kinds of ecosystems could contribute to a natural climate solution, to removing carbon dioxide. And this study estimated about 37% of carbon dioxide removal needed in 2030. But that was using the 2-degree limit. They haven't yet refined this number for the 1.5. So this made big news. There was a lot of press on this over the last year. There's now this big natural solutions campaign going on. And I think it really has drawn a lot of attention to this issue. And a lot of people are really continuing to work on this. Just to give you some idea of what they mean by natural climate solutions, these include not just forests, but also all kinds of forest management, plantations, and then improved agriculture and management in grasslands, management of grazing, and wetlands mitigation and restoration. But by and large, if you can see the big bar up on the top is reforestation. And this is a global reforestation, including plantations, including natural regeneration, including forest management. And this is the biggest bar on this, but you see that there's a very, very large error bar over here. So huge uncertainties in this estimate. So a group of scientists wanted to try to reduce those uncertainties. I'm going to share a little bit of this hot-breaking study with you today, as I've been one of the people involved in it. We wanted to reduce that confidence interval and get a better estimate. So this means that we have to take into account what are the factors that create that uncertainty. And one of the big factors is just getting a handle on what is the opportunity out there in terms of hectares for restoration or reforestation. Where can we do this? Or where should we do it? How much agricultural land do we encroach on? If that's needed in order to reach this number. What is the likelihood that new forest will persist at all? Simply because it's regrowing is no guarantee it will remain. And also, across the globe, there's a huge variation in the amount of carbon that forests take up as they grow. So in order to really get a better handle on this, this was a team partly including those Nature Conservancy leaders in the previous study. We embarked on a very ambitious effort to do geographically appropriate estimates of carbon accumulation rates from natural regeneration. And so this look involved a very extensive systematic review, over 12,000 research papers and measurements taken all over the world that were published and in the literature. From that, we used estimates of carbon storage in both above ground and the below ground biomass, soil, litter, and the coarse debris, so all of the sources of carbon across 2,080 sites. And we included a wide range, all of the possible areas we could find in 7 forest and forest savanna biomes, 42 countries, and 52 ecoregions. And the projections that we made about carbon storage started in 2020 and went for 30 years to 2050. So we could try to hit some target in 2050. And Susan Cook-Patton, who's the first author on this paper, is another Cornell alumnus along with me, although she came after I did. So go Cornell. Okay. So what did we find? This just shows a global map of the variation in the annual rates of carbon accumulation that we found. And note, this is carbon per hectare, not CO2. Okay, those are different metrics. What you see in the various shades of green are different levels of accumulation in forest, and the darker green are the highest rates that we have. And naturally, those are found in almost universally in the tropics. There's a few boreal regions also that have very high rates of carbon accumulation. And in the savanna regions, the highest ones are in orange. And as you might expect, because photosynthesis rates are higher in warmer, wetter places, so are the total uptake rates of forests. And we were able to predict a fairly good amount, 37% of that variation in biomass uptake, with information on the age of the forest and various variables about precipitation, not just the total amount, but also the seasonal variation in precipitation, added information to that. Temperature turned out to be not a really useful predictor as much in this model. And this just shows that stand age is a really important factor here. Obviously, you're starting from virtually no biomass. You have to build that up over time. And the rates at which that happens are very specific to different biomes and different types of vegetation. And this, you also see within each of these panels a huge amount of variability. So it's not just the fact that you can't expect the same rates of uptake within a biome without taking into consideration all of these other sources of variability. So in general, we found that over this 30-year period, that just looking at the natural regeneration of forests could remove up to 6.5 petagrams of CO2 per year. And just looking at the graph that that Natalie had up there earlier, that maxed out at about 3. So we have a much more robust estimate, and it's a much bigger number. And the greatest potential we found in forest in Africa and in Latin American tropics. We found about 11% of that is contributed by carbon accumulation in soil. And that overall, this number represents about 21% of the carbon dioxide removal needed in 2030 to constrain the global warming to the 2 degrees centigrade. And I'm trying to get Susan to come up with a number for the 1.5 that we can include in the paper. Now, what's interesting is that there's a lot of country-level variation because there's a lot of country-level variation in the amount of forest cover and in the amount that could potentially be reforested. So I just want to highlight here 10 countries that emerged from the analysis, which also has country-level data, that have in which the reforestation potential for CDR is more than their annual emissions. So this is a no-brainer, really, for these countries, that they can adopt natural regeneration as a really important component of their NDCs. And also, so this is not going to be universally the case, but we can certainly look to those countries where we know that it can make a big difference to encourage them to do so. Just one example from our work in Brazil, I work in the Atlantic forest with collaborators there, and this area has been deforested for a couple hundred years for the most part. And there's a very large-scale effort to restore forests in this region. There's a lot of political will. It's actually mandatory to restore on private lands. And what we did in the study was we looked at fine-scale satellite imagery at the last 20 years, 1996 to 2015, to identify areas where forests regrew naturally. We eliminated areas where plantations were put in and other kind of non-forest land uses. And we found over this whole region 2.7 million hectares of forest that regrew naturally. Okay? This was just on their own. This wasn't anybody's plan to reforest. And you can see a lot of these in this inset are very small patchy areas surrounding existing forest patches. We then developed a model that predicted what factors favored these areas of naturally regenerating forest, and then predicted over the next 20 years, assuming the conditions remain more or less the same. And we came up with a number of another 2.8 million hectares. So this might involve putting up a fence, but really it's not investing a huge amount of money in planting trees. So this is something where I'm working very, very hard to get into people's brains that we don't have to plant trees everywhere. It doesn't have to cost a huge amount of money, but we do need to use someone's land to do this. So there is an issue of foregoing agricultural use of land. However, there are lots of other benefits of letting forests regrow. And I think this is important to factor in to this whole approach. There are species out there that use those forests, and having more forest cover will help to prevent extinction of a lot of endangered species that are losing their habitats at a very fast rate. So there's an extinction debt already out there, and some studies are looking at where, if forests are reestablished, will that extinction debt go back down? Okay. But also, many people say, oh, well, you know, it's much better for planting trees. Why should we bother with natural regeneration? You know, we don't get all the commercial species we want in those forests. And so this study compared what happens when you compare a forest which is planted with native species with one that's regrowing naturally. This is also in the Atlantic forest. The red dots are plantations. On the left are species richness of trees, and you see initially it's pretty high in the plantations because you put them there, but that starts to decline over time because they die and they're not really being replaced. And the orange dots are naturally regenerating forests, and over time they start accumulating more and more species, and it's just going to keep going up and up. The green dots are reference forests for those regions. The biomass stocks in the middle diagram are higher initially in the planted forests. That's partly because the trees were taken care of and grasses were removed and they got a head start. But if you look on the right at the cost effectiveness of the restoration, which is really the bottom line, it's much higher in the naturally regenerating forests. So you could in fact get a lot more forest area restored using that approach. This is just a graph showing the projections of land use change, the historical trends, and where we are now, and what are the projections in the future in this whole right-hand side of the diagram. And you see the huge range in terms of what could happen. The green bar and the orange bar are what happens based on the country's national determined conditions, where they have made a commitment through the Paris Agreement. till 2050, how they're going to mitigate carbon. And the green ones are conditional on external funding. They're more ambitious. The orange ones don't require any external funding coming in. And you can see that there's a huge role here for land use change accommodation to mitigate climate change in countries. And in fact, if you look across all of these NDCs that were made under the Paris Agreement, forests represent a quarter of all of those planned emissions reductions. So already countries are getting on board with this. A recent paper, this just came out as I was preparing my talk a couple of weeks ago, also in PNAS, looking at globally the role of forest regrowth as a carbon sink. And the main novelty of this paper is that they actually have a database of forest age now globally. And they're able to show that the sink is really due to the young age of forests around the world, because those are the forests, they're still very actively growing, they're still actively accumulating biomass, and those are the ones that we need to rely on to suck up the CO2. And this study estimated that an additional 69 petagrams of carbon is going to accumulate in live biomass just by these forests continuing doing what they're doing. So this isn't really changing anything. This is just acknowledging that these forests are out there taking up carbon and growing very actively. And there's many young forests around the world. Oh, in fact, I just wanted to point out that this map shows the fraction of forests that are younger than 140 degrees that were classified as regrowth in this study. So anything that is in the yellow range has a very high fraction of the forest in this young stage. So these are places where we could expect a lot of mitigation from forest regrowth. And finally, I want to emphasize about these co-benefits, because we do have to change our behavior. And what better motivation to change our behavior when we can get so much more out of it, not just storing carbon, but we can also save species from extinction. We can also protect water supplies. We can also improve carbon adaptation. And there are additional benefits that I didn't even mention. So this is a study that hopefully will be coming out. And we looked at, this is just a moist forest in tropics zone analysis, but we looked at areas where we could maximize through restoration benefits for conserving biodiversity, benefits for carbon mitigation, benefits for carbon adaptation, that is providing habitats where animals, refuges for climate. That's not so much for people. But the last one is based on reducing water security threats to humans. And this analysis looked at these 4 benefits. We also looked at 3 factors that relate to feasibility. And we've combined all of things to look at where are the hot spots for where restoration is going to really be both beneficial and also feasible in the world. But the point I wanted to make here is that there are a few trade-offs that we found in the analysis, but by and large, we found a great amount of congruence. So areas that you're restoring for carbon are also going to lead, in many cases, to improving biodiversity conservation and reducing the threat of water, reducing water security. So I was asked to address some of these issues in my talk. I'm just going to end with a few slides to sort of summarize risks and some of the problems associated with this approach. First of all, it's effective. I've already shown you. It's very cost effective. But these types of land uses can't compete with commercial forestry or commercial agriculture right now. So it's not a level playing field. There are also unintended consequences. That is, just because a forest is regrowing doesn't mean it'll stay there. So there's a risk of that forest being cleared. There's a risk that some of these forests will suffer from fire and also just poor growth in general. And I think we could risk overselling this potential. And a really big issue is that if you're not allowed to clear the forests in your land or on your area, then you're going to rely on that forest being cut somewhere else. And then the risks need to be managed as well. And I think we're getting a handle on this. That is, we can do a much better job of looking at where natural regeneration is going to be a really good solution, and not just assume that it can happen anywhere and that we should try to do it everywhere. And also, if we could get those carbon prices to go up, this would also provide a much greater incentive for landowners, especially smallholders who really don't have any other source of income. And then there are equity and justice issues as well. Certainly, there's a big difference in who benefits from any kind of payment for environmental service programs, and we found that what we've looked at so far is that the smallholders that have very small forest holdings generally are left out of these benefits. Their areas are too small to qualify. Even if they did get paid, the amounts would be so small that it doesn't really make any difference to them. And there's the potential for the state to come in and say, well, we need this land for carbon, or we're going to take your land away and grow forest on it. And also, current regulations in a lot of countries that were put in place to protect from deforestation prohibit any kind of harvesting of trees from a native forest, even if it's a 10-year-old regrowth forest. So the farmers can't even get any economic benefit from this, whereas if they had planted a forest, they would be able to harvest those trees. And finally, who has a say in this? And I think that there's the potential for top-down government programs to be implemented that lack engagement of local stakeholders, and that ultimately will backfire. And finally, that the forest sector, are often the groups that are brought in terms of restoration programs, they lack the knowledge and the inclination to really train people about natural regeneration. They have an agenda of their own. They have 3 species they know how to grow, and that's what they do. Thank you very much. And so there's a real lack of proper training and education about how to promote natural regeneration. So I hope I've given you a somewhat optimistic view, but there's a big but here, and that is that these solutions are not going to be enough, and also that average of 6.5 is taking the 30-year total and dividing it by 30 years as if it was a linear progression, and it's not. So initially, the forests aren't going to deliver that much. It takes them a while, as you saw in those curves. So we need a lot of other solutions to be implemented right away as well. So just to conclude, we do have a very good option here with natural regeneration, and it's low cost, meaning that money could be spent on other types of things in addition to natural regeneration. And it also brings a lot of other benefits. So we can make a strong rationale for including a much broader engagement in this activity. But it is only a partial solution, and other natural climate solutions are needed. In addition, agricultural techniques and other kinds of ecosystem management techniques, as well as other outside of land use practices are needed. Thank you.